Game design is a complicated matter. It goes far beyond coming up with interesting ideas to put in a game. Half the work is developing the idea into something that's fun for the player. More often than not, an idea that looks interesting initially proves to be boring when put into the game. One such system is Drox Operative 2's planetary event and quest system. But what are the design elements and decisions that made it so bad? Can they be fixed? Perhaps, most importantly, what the hell is a Drox Operative? Drox Operative 2 is an action RPG where the player takes on the role of a titular space mercenary with more firepower than some of the local space empires. Unlike more traditional games in the genre, where the player follows a central plotline or does infinite dungeons and has little to no persistent impact on the world, this game follows a different approach to its overworld. Here, each campaign or sector is entirely procedurally generated, populated by AI-controlled space empires that engage in what is essentially a 4X game. They will explore, expand their territory, exploit the resources at their disposal, and of course they will try to exterminate one another. So it's a bit like Diablo, but inside of a Master of Orion game being played with a computer. The game gives the player a fair amount of ways to interact with and influence its universe. Most of the simulation is described in terms of events which may happen randomly or are caused by certain conditions. Some events are ongoing and will create quests for the player. For instance, an empire might ask the operative to deal with an NPC threat or take out a doomsday device in their system. Most events represent some penalty or an opportunity for a boost on a given planet. Completing their quest will simply remove this penalty or apply the boost. Some events, however, are organized into chains where ignoring its quest for some time will advance it to the next step, and completing it will either resolve the entire chain or take it in a new direction. On paper, it looks like the game's quests fit perfectly with its overworld. They offer explicit goals with rewards at the end and feed into the greater simulation, in theory allowing the player's actions to shape the entire playing field. In practice, unfortunately, they're a drab, repetitive mess that fails to live up to its promise. The quest chain I will use as my example is the planetary unrest, rebellion, and secession. Here's how it works. The first event in this chain is caused by a successful propaganda action from a rival empire or the player. While active, this event reduces the planet's production, and it will eventually deteriorate into riots and later civil war. Finally, if left untouched long enough, the planet will splinter off as a new rebel empire. Each event in this chain will generate a quest to deliver some weapons to the planet to neutralize it, removing all the negative modifiers. Alternatively, each event might spawn a rebel starship with its own quest, supply the rebellion to accelerate its advance to the next stage. As the player attempts to influence the greater simulation, they might be interested in all three paths, assisting the Empire, accelerating the rebellion, or weakening the Empire by not intervening and letting the negative events linger. Each of these paths has its own design problems. The non-intervention path is the simplest. The player really doesn't need to do anything at all, but the game faceplants even here. As the rebellion spreads and quests are generated, their entries on the quest list don't go anywhere. Look at this. This is from a small sector with only a few empires. Almost every single one of this empire's planets is in constant unrest. Just try to imagine what would happen in a large, densely populated one. In fairness, this looks like a minor inconvenience, and it probably is. However, it's inconveniences like these that color one's impression of the entire game. What's more, it's a constant inconvenience. The player will spend a lot of their time looking at this interface. This cluttered, awkward interface that's full of information that isn't even relevant to them. Every time they have to check if an empire has new quest for them, they'll have to go through this list. Once or twice it's fine, but every time they want to pick a new quest, it adds up. It gets annoying. it makes them not want to pick up any quests anymore. This is in some ways unavoidable, as the player needs to know of these quests and might keep a tab on active rebellion chains to tackle later on as part of their sector strategy. As a primarily interface problem, this calls for an interface solution. Perhaps grouping unrest quests in a separate window, introducing filters, or something to that effect. In any case, the system inconveniences the player even when they don't interact with it. Whether they simply don't want to run these kinds of quests, or it's a strategic choice on their part, they will suffer for it. But even if they try to resolve these events, they're not going to have a much easier time. If the player chooses to support the planetary government, they run into much more unpleasant problems. These quests simply require picking up a shipment of weapons. This shipment is usually generated not too far away from the rebellious planet, sometimes on one of its moons or even the planet itself. However, no matter how close the shipment is, the Empire will never lift a finger to support its own citizens. Insert typical joke here. But the problems are not over when the player helps quiet unrest. These events usually start from propaganda actions by other empires. These other empires will be all too happy to keep up the information war. Sometimes a new attack happens mere minutes after the last rebellion has been dealt with. Although the specific mechanics of this cannot be cleaned without looking under the game's bonnet, they likely use the same levers as the player, spending resources and planting spies. Even though they have a chance of being found out, the offending empire likely has nothing to lose. It is probably already at war with its target, so the hit to relations will not affect anything, at least not meaningfully. That is, assuming that the AI goes into such decision making at all, of course, and does not just choose to act at random. This entire process is very frustrating for the player, as it only provides the tools for a short-term solution. If they choose to support the Empire this way, they've just reduced their planet annihilating starship to a delivery tuk-tuk. Somehow I don't think this fits the game's intended fantasy experience or challenge. The solution to this type of problem is threefold. First, the Empire should be able to respond to unrest without involving the player. Either spend some resources to have a chance of quelling the rebellion locally, or spawn a freighter to deliver a shipment. This option will also create an emergent situation the player can interact with by either intercepting or protecting the ship. Second, successfully quelling a rebellion should create a new recovery event that prevents the same event chain from starting again. Leave some lingering negative effects as the planet recovers, maybe a quarter of what they were when the chain was active, but prevent the simulation from throwing out essentially the same quest for a while. Third, the player, or the Empire itself, should have a means of actively preventing new unrest. For example, funding counter-propaganda that reduces the chance of this event chain starting. If spies are involved, the game should have a counter-espionage system that the AI Empire can use to protect their planets. Trying to force an empire to splinter is the most frustrating path for the player to take in this event chain. Whether sponsored by them or a rival empire, the event chain starts with a propaganda action. This has a chance of succeeding, and then there's a chance that it will lead to actual unrest. Once it begins, the entire chain is a crapshoot. Although it will not clear up by itself, it might advance to the next step in an unknown amount of time. It also might spawn a rebel ship and quest to help the rebels. The ship might get destroyed by something, failing the quest, but keeping the planetary event going. The required shipment might spawn on a planet belonging to an empire that's hostile to the player, making it virtually impossible to acquire and deliver. Finally, completing the quest might advance the chain. Together, All these mights are quite likely to put the whole thing in an unwinnable position for the player trying to get a planet to secede. Did I mention that creating a rebel empire unlocks that empire's ship for future campaigns? Because it does! Good thing it tends to happen naturally, without the player's involvement, in an empire they haven't even interacted with yet. But this raises an obvious question. If it happens essentially at random, why give the player the option to try controlling it? That's a surefire way of wasting their effort and with it their desire to keep playing. The solution centers on preventing unwinnable softlock states, making the chain more transparent, and controlling the random factors. For example, giving the player a clear and obvious description of the event's progression. If an unrest event escalates due to an external trigger, it should be explained. If the only factor to this escalation is time, the player should see a timer. There is, of course, a risk of making it too transparent and spoiling exact timers and percentages, but it's nothing a layer of obfuscation won't fix. Just show an estimate. A rebel ship should always appear, even though it can take some time, another quest, or an external event to show up. If the player can influence this, they should be informed of it. Guarantee that the required shipment spawns on a planet where the player can pick it up. At the very least, not a hostile one. The player is likely to already be at war with their target and thus have no access to its shops. Thankfully, the same general solutions can be applied to any quest chain in the game, though they will have to be adapted to the specifics of that chain, obviously enough. While this will require major expansion for some of them, it will not require any new mechanisms to be introduced to the game. Although obviously that is only an educated guess without access to the game's codebase. Sometimes what seems like a minor shift from the outside actually requires a major internal refactoring, but that's a subject for an entire new discussion. Let's not waste your time here. Of course, the over-reliance on plain delivery quests and the lack of variety in chains in general are also issues, but they're content issues, not design ones. Adding more stuff is rarely a bad idea, provided said stuff makes good use of the game's existing systems, is appropriate, and generally justifies the time and resources spent on its development. For example, I could easily argue for the inclusion of a smuggling system that would allow an operative to sneak onto a hostile planet to pick up or deliver goods without having to pay off its empire for a temporary ceasefire. I could even draft a design that ties it to the espionage, relationship, and equipment systems. That would still be counterproductive though, as it essentially sticks another system onto a game that doesn't even make full use of what it has. That, of course, is just one example of an undercooked system in a game. It's a telling example though, because quests, in one way or another, are a central system in an action RPG. The event system, meanwhile, is central to Drox Operative's 4X simulation. The interface between these two should be the player's entry point, one of their primary means of interaction with the game. So when this interface fails to operate, what results is a game that's broken in the most upsetting way. Exceptionally promising in theory, but underwhelming and boring when you actually play it. If questing, and by extension the whole interface between the game's ARPG and 4X components, functioned better, it would be much easier to overlook Drox Operative 2's other flaws because of how unique this feature was. Of course, Drox isn't the only game that suffers from this sort of thing. In fact, it may be distressingly common in the industry. This game just has its issues much closer to the surface, which makes it easy to point my finger at it and go, hey, this is broken. See if you can come up with any more examples down in the comments section. If nothing else, it'd be fun to talk about those. Thank you for sticking around to the end. This is only my second video, but I hope I've made something interesting. This early in one's development as a video creator, or whatever this thing I'm doing is called, should I even care? Anyway, feedback is important, so if you like this sort of thing, please let me know with a like. I've got more game design related videos planned, so if you'd like to stay tuned for more of this sort of thing, there's also a subscribe button. Thank you once again for listening to me ramble on about video games, and I hope to see you again next time.